Hey there, and welcome to Shop Fix, a community joined together for the love of woodworking. My name is William Mandry, and in today's episode, I want to review my 10-inch Rikon woodworking bandsaw to give you the pros, the cons, and help you determine if you need a benchtop bandsaw for your specific wood shop. Stick around.
Shop Fix. It's for the love of woodworking.
Now, before we get into the pros and cons, I kind of want to go over the specs as well as the functions and some of the stuff you get when purchasing this bandsaw. Now, I did purchase the additional stand for it. The stand does not come with the bandsaw. So if you want to have this raised up off the floor, you're going to have to build a stand or buy the stand. Now, right off the bat, if you're considering a benchtop model such as this 10-inch Rikon bandsaw, I highly recommend building a stand for it. I actually regret purchasing this stand. I think it's overpriced and it doesn't really serve any functions except raising it off the floor. There's not really any storage there. It would be nice to have some cabinets underneath there because it's kind of wasted space. So that's my first recommendation is if you're ever working with a benchtop model, especially a benchtop bandsaw, I highly recommend you building a stand for it. So the metal stand of this bandsaw wasn't included in the purchase price. However, you do get a handy little rip fence that attaches to the tabletop as well as a miter gauge fence. Now I kind of want to go over some more of the specs of this bandsaw. Now, the blade length, and you can see I'll open these up, is 70.5 inches. So any blades that you purchase for this bandsaw will be 70.5 inches. The blade width, you could go from an 1/8 inch to a 1/2 inch blade on to these wheels. Now the table size is 12.5 inches deep and 13 3/4 wide. The fence is about 13.5 inches. The table can tilt from 0 degrees to 45 degrees in case you need to cut something at a 45-degree angle. Two important factors to note is that the distance between here and the blade gives you a maximum cutting width of 9 5/8 inches. And when you raise the blade guard all the way up, I'll show you an example of that. When we unscrew this and raise this blade guard all the way up, which is controlled by a knob in the back, we'll raise that all the way up and then you lock it back in, and that gives you, again, a maximum cutting height at 4 5/8 inches. So blade changes on bandsaws aren't usually that tricky. However, on this bandsaw, they have the cutout on the tabletop to take the blade out at the front. And so you actually have to take off this measuring device with the Allen screw and remove it to even take out a blade. Now most bandsaws have the cutout to the side. So when you take out the blade, you could simply scoot it out the side and you don't have to remove anything on the tabletop or any moving parts. That's something kind of unique on this bandsaw that I wanted to mention. So once you've chosen the width of blade that you want to use on this specific bandsaw and you have it installed onto your wheels, you're going to have to tension it correctly. Now, one thing I want to note here is that this specific model, the 10-305 10-inch Rikon bandsaw, doesn't have a gauge for tensioning on the back. So you're gonna have to get a feel for it or do something like a flutter test. So there's a few ways to correctly tension a bandsaw blade, but you're gonna have to learn one of those methods because there's no indicator on the back of the bandsaw, which in my opinion is a con to this model. One thing that I've also learned is that a lot of people recommend untensioning your blade when it's not in use. And I think what they mean is when you're gonna be out for a season, like 3 months, yeah, I can understand untensioning the blade and leaving it untensioned. However, if you tension the blade and get it dialed in correctly, I would not untension it just because you're not gonna be working with it for 2 or 3 days or even a week. So not only do you have to get the blade tensioning correctly on this Rikon bandsaw without a gauge, you also have to track the blade just like any other bandsaw. So that's not something specific to this bandsaw. Now to track the blade, you have to adjust these ball bearings. There's one on the left, the right, and the back, and then there's some on the bottom. to help that blade track correctly when cutting. And there's many different methods to do this. One method that I know is just by spinning the wheel by hand, looking at where that blade is contacting the ball bearings and moving them by hand and locking them in. Some other people use like thin material between the blade and the ball bearings to get that locked in. But whatever method you use, you're just gonna have to know that you're gonna have to track the blade correctly with the ball bearings on this machine. So not only do you have to make sure that the blade is tracking correctly on the ball bearings, but you also have to make sure that the blade is tracking correctly on the 10-inch wheels. Now, if you're lucky, the machine that you get will already have wheels that are balanced correctly and tracking the blade correctly. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that this isn't a machine that you're just gonna get right out and it's gonna cut correctly right in the beginning. It's gonna take a while to dial in. It might even take you multiple days if it's your first time getting a bandsaw. In my experience, getting this bandsaw was almost more of a headache than what it was worth. I had troubles getting the wheels balanced correctly, and it's very difficult to adjust in their setup. It's very difficult to balance the wheels. That's something to keep in mind too. Okay, so now I kind of want to summarize the pros and cons to this 10-inch Rikon woodworking bandsaw. And to be honest, this bandsaw doesn't have any unique pros to it that another bandsaw wouldn't have. So basically this bandsaw is similar to other bandsaws, however all the features are kind of limited in aspect because this is sold at a lower price point. However, I don't think the reduced price makes up for the reduced features. You know, one of the pros that I thought at first was, hey, this bandsaw could house very thin blades and it can cut those tight radiuses, but even bigger bandsaws you can install an 1/8-inch blade on. So that's not something unique to this bandsaw. Especially like the fence it comes with, the miter gauge fence. Most bandsaws can house a fence, like an aftermarket fence. So that's not very unique. The blade tensioning is rather difficult, so that'll be a con because it doesn't have a gauge. And most bandsaws of a little bit higher price point all have gauges that make tensioning the blade much easier. The blade changes on this bandsaw seem to be trickier than other bandsaws, so you have to actually disassemble this front measuring device just to get the blade out, whereas other bandsaws just go from the side with no obstruction to get that blade out. This bandsaw also doesn't come with a stand, so I spent a lot of money on a stand, and I wish I would have just saved the money from the stand in the machine and added a little bit more money later down the road to buy a bigger model. Now, it's not the fact that Rikon isn't a good company. I have other Rikon products that are amazing. And in fact, the larger bandsaws made by Rikon are much, much better. And because the features and the capability of them are much greater. They just seem to try to make a budget bandsaw that didn't quite, pack the punch that I thought it would be at the price point. Overall, I would not recommend buying this bandsaw, even at the price point. I don't think it's worth your money. I think your money is definitely better spent on different tools and machines. If you are trying to get a machine or tool that does similar things as this model does, I would either recommend paying a little bit more money for a larger model that has more features and capabilities, or I would recommend buying a cheaper jigsaw. In fact, in my opinion, a really nice handheld jigsaw might be worth your money more than this bandsaw, because a handheld jigsaw can be used in various circumstances. Whether you're trying to cut something outside, you could take that handheld jigsaw with you, whereas this bandsaw is stationary and has a limited capacity. And a jigsaw could cut something at any width, whereas this only has a 9 5/8 inch width. Also with the jigsaw, you have the ability to cut much more dynamic cuts and longer ones, because if you have a really big piece of wood and you're trying to cut it on here, well, there's only so far you can turn it and you start hitting things. So that's something to think about too. I really hope that you found this review helpful in determining whether or not you want to purchase this Rikon model, a model of a similar design, or whether or not you even need a 10-inch woodworking bandsaw in your specific shop. If you appreciate those recommendations, please smash that like button and subscribe to the ShopFix channel. I'll see you in the next video.